Long before the roar of factories, before steel tools rolled off mechanized lines, there walked through the towns and villages of Britain a figure both familiar and faintly uncanny. People called him the tinker, the wandering mender of broken pots, but in those days, the word carried a mixture of respect, suspicion, and something nearly folkloric. Imagine a cold morning mist curling above a cobbled road, and from it emerges a man with a battered cart, a small firebox, a pouch of metal, and the promise that nothing, not even the humblest pot, must be thrown away. For centuries, the tinker's arrival was a small event, a ripple in the slow rhythm of pre-industrial life. Housewives stepped out of their cottages to greet him with dented kettles, cracked pans, or pewter cups whose seams had surrendered to years of boiling, scraping, and open hearth heat. To us today, such objects feel trivial, replaceable. But in a world where every vessel traveled from hand to hand, through inheritance or barter, a damaged pot was not refuse, it was a wound. And the tinker, with his glinting ladle of molten tin, acted almost like a healer. Yet his craft was never just a craft. Villagers called his repairs magic of the practical kind. Children swore they saw sparks dance in strange colors when he melted his alloy. Elders whispered that tinkers knew the hidden routes between towns, the ones where Roman stone still slept under moss. No one truly understood how a man could arrive from nowhere, fix a lifetime's worth of metal, and vanish before dawn as though he'd never touched the earth at all. But the truth was humbler, and far more fascinating. A good tinker needed an understanding of metal that rivaled that of a smith. He had to know exactly how hot tin must run before it could seep into a crack without warping the vessel entirely. He carried clamps and irons worn smooth from thousands of repairs, each one a continuation of a skill passed down through generations of travelers, often from father to son. His profession survived because it saved people money, but it thrived because it restored continuity in homes where everything else was fragile. When a pot returned from the tinker's hands, transformed from broken to whole, it felt almost as though time itself had bent back into place. And so, from market towns to remote hamlets, the sound of his tapping tools echoed like a reminder that even in a harsh world, things could be fixed. If you knew where to look, and whom to trust. To watch a tinker work was to witness a kind of restrained theater. He began by examining the vessel with a seriousness usually reserved for a physician. His fingertips traced every dent, every hairline split, learning the story of the object before he touched a single tool. Then came the cleansing, soot scraped away with a small steel blade, residue lifted gently with sand or powdered brick. A pot needed to be stripped of its past injuries for the repair to hold, and the tinker knew that metals, like people, refused to heal under layers of old damage. Once cleaned, the pot was clamped between wooden jaws, locked firm but never crushed. The tinker's firebox, a tin cylinder the size of a loaf, glowed with burning charcoal. Over it he rested a ladle holding slivers of tin alloy. Within moments, a pale, glimmering pool formed, its surface trembling like mercury. Some villagers believed that if you stared into that molten reflection long enough, you could see your future. The tinker never encouraged such talk, but he didn't deny it either. Superstition, after all, made people watch more respectfully. Then came the pivotal moment. The tinker tilted the ladle, guiding the silver stream into the wound of the pot. A hiss, a puff of smoke, a metallic scent. Tin flowed into the crack, sealing it from within. When done well, the seam hardened so flawlessly that the pot felt reborn, not quite as it was, but stronger where it had once been weak. After cooling, the tinker polished the scar until it caught the light like a thin crescent moon. But life as a tinker was never purely technical. It meant constant travel, endless negotiation with weather, and the wary glances of townsfolk who saw wanderers as both necessary and unsettling. In medieval Britain, tinkers were often listed among the service nomads, those who roamed because their skills were too specialized for a single village to support. Some parishes welcomed them with bread and ale, others insisted they sleep outside town walls, as though their mobility made them a threat. And yet, despite suspicion, everyone depended on them. Archaeologists have uncovered household inventories from the 16th and 17th centuries showing pots mended repeatedly, sometimes 3, 4, even 8 times, each repair attributed to a different tinker by the mark he scratched discreetly onto the metal. These marks, often no more than a single line or a tiny geometric shape, formed a hidden history beneath lids and handles, a quiet map of the craft's passage across Britain. Each pot became a record of invisible journeys. Tinkers themselves, though rarely writing anything, understood their role in the fragile balance of rural life. They were keepers of objects, preservers of continuity in families who owned little enough as it was. And for that, people sought them out, even if they'd never fully trust them. By the 18th century, the tinker's world was changing, though not yet disappearing. Britain's towns were swelling, markets growing louder, and the first threads of industrialization were tightening like invisible wires around the old rhythms of life. Still, in the folds of the countryside, the tinker's cart creaked on. Children recognized the sound instantly, a gentle clatter of metal bowls, hooks, and tools, and ran to their doorways as though a storyteller had arrived. Among the tales passed down about these wandering craftsmen, one stands out, preserved in parish records from Shropshire. A tinker arrived in a village just after harvest, offering repairs as usual. A local widow handed him a battered copper kettle, saying it had belonged to her mother and was the only heirloom she possessed. While the tinker worked, a crowd gathered, drawn by the rising smell of hot tin and the rhythmic tapping of his small hammer. But something unusual happened. When he finished, the kettle sounded different. Its tone, when flicked, rang clearer than any copper the villagers had heard. The widow swore that water boiled faster in it afterwards. Superstition grew quickly. Some whispered that the tinker had reforged not just the metal but the history inside it. Others argued he must have mixed his tin with some secret alloy. The truth, however, is simpler and more revealing. The tinker had reinforced the kettle from within using a double patch, a rare technique requiring incredible precision. It redistributed heat so efficiently that the vessel genuinely performed better. What felt like alchemy was, in fact, pure skill sharpened through decades of wandering work. Stories like this fueled a quiet reverence for tinkers, but they also fed suspicion. A man who could improve an object seemed uncomfortably close to someone who could alter other things, fortunes, perhaps, or the unseen order of a household. For this reason, many communities watched tinkers closely, never allowing them too near their barns or their daughters, yet always grateful when a pot was restored and a few shillings changed hands. But the true tension of this era came from elsewhere. As industrial workshops began producing cheaper metalware, people wondered whether the tinker's craft would fade. Why mend a pot when one from Birmingham or Sheffield could be bought for less? And yet, the answer persisted in every cottage where money was scarce and sentiment precious. People still brought their oldest kettles, their cracked pewter plates, their pans blackened from decades of fire. Objects that held memory resisted replacement. For the tinkers themselves, this period was both a challenge and a strange opportunity. Industrialization pushed them into more remote areas, places where repair remained essential. And in these quiet regions, their craft reached its finest maturity, tin poured with careful grace, clamps adjusted by instinct, and the soft glow of charcoal illuminating the worn faces of men who carried the last echoes of a pre-industrial world within their hands. As the 19th century unfolded, the world accelerated. Machines thundered in factories, railways carved through quiet valleys, and mass-produced metalware flooded markets with a speed unimaginable a generation earlier. For the tinker, this new age arrived not as a single blow, but as a slow rearranging of the ground beneath his feet. He still traveled, still repaired, but each year brought fewer cracked pots and more cheap replacements. Where once people treated their cookware as companions to be preserved, now they began to see them as commodities, useful, yes, but no longer sacred. Yet in this shrinking space, the tinker's craft revealed its deepest layers. Industrial goods were uniform, predictable, identical from Cornwall to Yorkshire. But the tinker offered something machines could not: judgment. He knew when a pot needed a simple seam or when the entire base had to be reinforced with a thin tin disc. He could tell by sound, a single tap, whether a kettle had been overheated or dropped. His craft lived in those tiny decisions, invisible to anyone watching, but essential to the longevity of the object he touched. One diary from Devon, written by a farmhand in 1847, describes a tinker who repaired an entire household's cookware during a storm that cut the valley off from the nearest town. The farmhand wrote that the tinker worked, as though the rain itself instructed him, patching pots and strengthening metal fatigued by years of boiling milk and stew over open hearths. When the family asked why he bothered, knowing that new pots could be bought cheaply once the roads cleared, he simply replied, "Because yours know your fire." That phrase lingered. It captured something industrialization was beginning to erase, the intimate relationship between people and the things they used daily. Tinkers understood that a well-worn pot carried the memory of a home, its temperature, its smoke, its rhythm. Replacing it meant breaking a thread of continuity that most families didn't realize they valued until it was gone. But time pressed forward. By mid-century, many tinkers abandoned the road, taking work in factories or settling as stationary metalworkers in growing towns. Their wandering lives, marked by smoky campfires, wet roads, and the endless search for the next village, began to fade into folklore. Some families recalled a tinker who used to visit every spring, others spoke of one who slept in their barn during harsh winters. But year by year, fewer travelers came. And the silence after they disappeared felt oddly heavy, as though a small but essential heartbeat of rural Britain had slowed. Still, in remote regions, in the Highlands, the Welsh borders, the quiet folds of Cumbria, the last true tinkers continued their rounds. They carried on not because the world demanded their craft, but because it had shaped every part of their identity. Each repaired pot, each trail across a rain-soaked field, each night spent under the wide, indifferent sky, it was a life lived between villages, between eras, between the old Britain and the new. By the late 19th century, the figure of the tinker had drifted to the edges of memory, becoming part history, part ghost story. Travelers still passed along Britain's narrow lanes, but the craft that once defined them had thinned to a whisper. What remained was an echo, a glint of tin in an abandoned kit, a scrap of charcoal-stained cloth, a faint ring of metal on metal recalling skills no longer widely practiced. And yet, the legacy of the tinker never truly vanished. It simply retreated into the objects they once saved, lingering in those faint, silvery seams that still catch the light if one knows where to look. Museum collections today display pots repaired centuries ago, each bearing a scar shaped by a particular pair of hands. Some seams are neat, barely wider than a thread, others are bold, thick strokes of molten tin, evidence of hurried work during winter markets. These marks are more than simple repairs, they are signatures of a world that valued longevity over convenience. In an age before disposability, a mended pot represented not poverty, but resilience. It was a quiet declaration that objects could earn their place in a household, surviving calamities and celebrations alike. Historians studying pre-industrial Britain often speak of the economy of repair, a cultural mindset in which nothing was wasted. And at the center of that mindset stood the tinker, the itinerant mediator between damage and renewal. His craft preserved more than metal, it preserved continuity. The pot mended by a tinker carried on into the next generation, bearing stories alongside stew and boiling water. It was, quite literally, history that could be held in one's hands. Perhaps that is why traces of the tinker's mystique remain even today. Walk through an old British village at dusk and you might still find, tucked behind a pub or leaning near a hearth, a pot whose faint seam gleams softly in fading light. It is a reminder that long before industry, before machines shaped our world, a different rhythm guided life, one where patience was a virtue, tools were extensions of memory, and the steady hands of a wandering craftsman kept communities stitched together. And in a way, the tinker's spirit survives in modern restoration work, in conservators who fight against decay, in artisans who repair rather than replace, in every act of preservation that defies the easy lure of disposability. Each repair is a small defiance against forgetting, a gesture the old tinkers would have understood deeply. If you've enjoyed this journey into the hidden corners of British history, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments what other forgotten crafts or traditions you'd like to explore. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Old Britain Secrets. There are many more stories waiting in the shadows of the past.